Hello, welcome to Controversies in Church History. This is Derek Taylor, and this episode we're gonna continue our series on the Traditionalist movement, 1964 to the present. This is episode 2, which I'm calling Disobedient People, 1964 to 1974. Now, last time I talked about the beginnings, the origins of this movement, what caused it. We're going to get into the actual narrative today and talk about how the new Mass was introduced, why that caused consternation among some people, but that only a few actively began to oppose the introduction of the new Mass and the suppression of the old one, and why they did this. And this week we're also going to focus mostly on the lay side of this movement, how laymen reacted and what they did. Next time we'll do the clergy, which is, you'll see why I'll treat them as separate issues here, but also because lay reaction actually in some ways precedes, at least public lay reaction, precedes the clergy for reasons that will become apparent, I think. And so let me begin with an anecdote. We're talking about the introduction of the new Mass. John Casey, who was a lecturer in English at Cambridge University, told a story years ago about a student he had at Cambridge who was Polish, early 1980s. And this student had been an altar server when he was a boy for the Archbishop of Krakow in Poland. That archbishop, of course, was Karol Wojtyła, who eventually became Pope John Paul II. And the story this student told him was this, that after he'd become John Paul II, this student decided to go to Rome and look him up and see if he couldn't visit the Pope. And John Paul II, being the jovial person that he was, agreed to see him. And so when he goes up to him, the first thing he did, according to this student, is sort of fist bump him in the chest. That's John Paul II doing this. And starts immediately saying the first words of the old Latin Mass to him, Intuibo ad altare Dei, I will go unto the altar of God. I can't remember the next parts. Ad laetificat juventutem meam, to the God who gives joy to my youth. It's the next Latin phrase that the server would give in the old rite. And they went through this until they got to the Confiteor, to the Confession of Faith in the Latin rite. And then according to this student, John Paul II then sort of stopped and shrugged and said, well, that's no good to us anymore. And the student said, no, Holy Father, and that's why I don't go to church anymore. And John Paul II immediately responded, well, don't blame me. It was that maniac, John the 23rd, that did this. And I give you that story, which is, by the way, if that's what John Paul II actually said, is not accurate. The reform of the liturgy is primarily the work of Paul II. Paul VI, I should say, Pope Paul VI. John the 23rd, if you don't know, actually issued a year before he died a document, an apostolic constitution called Veterum Sapientia, which actually called for greater study of Latin in seminaries and keeping Latin. He wasn't going to get rid of Latin. By the way, he issued this and everybody ignored it, so it didn't matter in the end, but it was not John the 23rd who did this, but it does give you some inkling. And we don't really know, by the way, what happened on the ground in terms of the effect, the sort of overnight changes to the Mass that happened, and how this affected people's faith. We have lots of anecdotes about people leaving the church when they changed this. No one's ever studied it, as far as I'm aware, in a serious scholarly way. But it gives you an indication. So for some people, when they did this, that just kind of almost destroyed the faith for them. But how could this be? How could this happen? And this goes back to the way this was done, partly, because what happens is in 1964, Paul VI, before the councils even ended, they've already, during the Second Vatican Council, issued the Constitution on the Liturgy, calling for reform, and he issues temporary norms in 1964 and allows people to start making changes even before the council's over. And so you get the first rollout of vernacular masses in 1964 at Advent. And to give you an idea of what kind of changes we're talking about here, let me read a little excerpt from the historian James O'Toole about what this was like. And he gives this description. I'm quoting here. Parishioners sitting in their places that morning knew something was different from the moment the Mass began. The week before, the priest and altar boys had entered in silence. Now everyone was expected to sing at least 2 verses of a processional hymn. The scriptural passages for the day were read aloud in the vernacular. The priest, standing behind a new altar set up in the middle of the sanctuary, still said some prayers in Latin, but the people were encouraged to recite others along with him, again in their own language. The distribution of communion was now different. In the past, the priest had repeated a prayer in Latin as he worked his way along the line of parishioners kneeling at the altar. He now paused in front of each parishioner, in many places standing rather than kneeling, held up the communion host so they could see it, and said, Corpus Christi, body of Christ, to which the communicant responded, Amen. In a few months, this too would be said in English, and the altar rail itself would be gone. The Church discontinued all Latin by 1969. Thus, James O'Toole. And so what happened was you had changes being made almost immediately. And we need to clarify who's doing what here, because this is important. Paul VI issues a motu proprio in 1964, creating a commission, or sometimes called a concilium, the concilium for implementing the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, which is established to implement the liturgy. And it has a lot of independence. It works closely with Paul VI. And he issues this motu proprio Sacrum Liturgiam, giving permission to do things like, again, open things up to the vernacular, doing stuff like this. Readings are to be done, facing the people. That was different. The new formula for distributing communion, which I just sort of illustrated there. Those sorts of things, as well as Mass facing the people. That was introduced, not by the conciliar document itself, Sacrosanctum Concilium, but by this instruction that's given by this concilium called Inter Ecumenici in 1964, the first instruction on how to do this. But what happens is, besides these minimal changes, all of a sudden other things start getting introduced into the liturgy. Things like freestanding altars, removal of altar rails, communion in the hand, which will become a flashpoint for traditionalists. But this was not commanded either by the concilium or by Paul VI or by the council. How did it get there? Basically, what happens in the period 1964 to 1970 is that you're going to have professional liturgists who are charged with implementing these reforms at the level of bishops' conferences, basically taking the initiative to make changes on their own. A lot of these liturgists have been trained in liturgical centers, liturgical training centers in Europe and the United States. I won't go into this in too much detail. There had been a liturgical movement at the beginning of the 20th century, which urged reforms to the liturgy. And they had a lot of ideas, these professional liturgists. No one took them very seriously until the Second Vatican Council. And now that they had some authority, they began interpreting the documents of the Second Vatican Council and these instructions that this concilium issued to include these sorts of things. And that's how a sort of free-for-all will sort of begin after 1964. All of a sudden, people just start making changes like crazy, which is what's going to, of course, bring about the Traditionalist movement. Now, is this sort of thing, these sorts of events, and I'm not going to dwell too much on the craziness, I mentioned that last time. I'll go on a little bit more in a second here, but this is what leads to the formation of the first of these lay traditionalist groups. And the first one I've already mentioned before, mentioned last time, the most important of these is Una Voce, which, again, means one voice. It's established in 1964 in Norway and then in France. Then it spreads to different countries around Europe and then eventually the United States. And again, its membership fluctuates over the years. It is still in existence. It is still the oldest and probably most important of these organizations. And it is basically a lay organization, a purely volunteer organization, whose main interest at first is to preserve Latin in the liturgy. And this is something that's an important thing to note. I'll come back to this. Nobody really knows after 1964 what's coming, what kind of changes are going to come, when they're going to end. The confusion, I can't stress this enough, in the 1960s and 70s, the confusion really drives a lot of things because there's just not a lot that's certain all of a sudden. Once the old mass seemingly is out, and we'll get to this in a moment, how it formally is supposed to be suppressed, it leads to a lot of chaos. And one of the things about this, they formed themselves as an international body in 1967, and they will choose as the first president of Una Voce a man who I need to dwell on here, a guy named Eric Maria Vermeeren de Saventham, Eric de Saventham we'll call him, who I mentioned last time was an important figure in this movement, was a convert from Lutheranism, came from an old noble family in Germany. And he's important, well, partly because of his background. I mean, I mentioned he's kind of a patrician type. Both his family, he grew up, born in 1919. He grew up in Germany during the era of the Nazis. Both his family and the family of his wife, whom he marries, a countess named Elizabeth, who's also important in the formation of Una Voce and its operation. She comes from an old Catholic family. He converts when he's 14. But they're all firmly anti-Nazi. And to give you an idea of what kind of guy this is, he manages to get stationed by the Nazi government in Istanbul. He's trying to get out of the country and bring his wife with him, but they won't send his wife with him. So he had to go back to Germany and try to sneak her out. And what happens is they get stopped by the Gestapo as they're about to leave the country. And they have to enlist the aid of I believe it's a Hungarian ambassador to fly her out on a courier plane at the last minute to escape the Gestapo. So this is a fairly, again, this is an interesting person anyway. In any event, the Saventham and his wife make their way eventually to Britain, where eventually they have to start over. They work as school teachers at first. He eventually gets a job with Lloyd's of London, working in insurance, I should say. And he'll, over time, come to work first in Zurich, at the Zurich branch of Lloyd's of London, the famous company, and then take over the European branch in 1964. And this is important because it means that de Saventham, because of his background, because of his connections, is multilingual. He knows how to get around Europe. He knows people in circles he knows people in the hierarchy. So he is perfectly placed to communicate the concerns of people who are affected by these changes and don't like them. And he probably is the most important, one of the 2 or 3 most important laymen involved in the early traditionalist movement. Now, just to get that aside, I'll get to them in a moment, what they do early on. But if you wonder what they do, they basically are, petitioning. We'll see in a moment. Mostly, I guess you could call them a pressure group to a certain degree. But they're an association of the lay faithful to make known the concerns of the lay faithful about this. That's something, by the way, that the Second Vatican Council calls the lay faithful to do, is to organize and get them involved. Well, here you go. You have a lay organization doing this. And it is worth repeating that in 1965, again, what Una Voce is for it's mostly just about Latin. Because, as I mentioned last time, there was an interim missal that was issued in 1965, which was, I think if they had stopped there with the reforms, there would be no traditionalist movement. Yes, they changed some things, they turned some things into the vernacular, they added some prayers here and there, they took some away, but that inner liturgy was much more in line, I think, than what the council wanted. And in fact, to give you an idea of how fluid everything is, let me read this passage for you briefly. This is from 1965, from a cleric who had been a bishop at the council, talking about the Reformed liturgy in 1965, as they understood the reform that was going on in 1965. Quote, "In my humble opinion, 2 such reforms seemed useful." Some of the things that the council called for. First, the rites of the first part of the Mass, that is, and also a few translations into the vernacular. The priest coming near the faithful, communicating with them, and praying and singing with them, and therefore standing in the pulpit, saying the collect, the epistle, and the gospel in their language. The priest singing in the divine, singing in the traditional melodies, the Kyrie and the Gloria, the Creed along with the faithful. These are so many good reforms that give back to that part of the Mass its true finality, unquote. The bishop who wrote those words in 1965 was Marcel Lefebvre, the founder of the Society of St. Pius X. He'd been at the council, he'd had some problems with things at the council, but he'd signed the document Sacrosanctum Concilium. He was actually for reform. What's going to happen after 1964 and 1965, however, is things are going to go berserk. And just things on the ground, but also things among professional liturgists. I mentioned before, had been sort of jonesing for decades to try to get their hands on the liturgy, to implement all their good ideas. And just to give you an idea what people are writing in the 1960s about this, just a few examples here. In 1966, one Benedictine monk said that worship should be characterized above all by spontaneity. He suggested that a successful Mass might be one which, quote, generated the fun of a successful cocktail party, unquote. A Jesuit would characterize the old traditional liturgy as being, quote, a breeding ground for atheism, because it seemed to make God irrelevant to life, unquote. Later on, an editor of a journal called Worship said that contemporary man does not deny the transcendental, but he seeks it within the life of this world. There is no hope for liturgical reform, which would equate the secular with the profane, etc. Another journal, Concilium, that's founded in 1969 by European theologians, rejected what they call, quote, mythical symbols, which lend a magic, superstitious character to public prayer and devotion, the unhealthy climate of escapist dreams, unquote. They called for, quote, the symbols of a freedom which creates its own forms, its own interhuman dialogue, where man represents God and finds his image of God, unquote. Another writer, a Spanish Benedictine writing in the same liturgy, dismissed what he called the, quote, archaic and meaningless, unquote, trappings of the old liturgy, and warned that using it would create, quote, the practicing type of Catholic rather than the believing type of Catholic, unquote. And this is another quotation from that same author, quote, only a God of the dead could be pleased with such glacial homage, and the faithful who do not rebel on seeing the community, enclosed in such a funereal apparatus, probably believe not in God, or not in the God of rites, but in the rites themselves. And you have, in general, liturgists writing things like this all the time. That old liturgy is terrible. It's the reason why people no longer believe in the faith. We need to get rid of it and and replace it with something new and spontaneous and etc., and whatever. People talking about things like desacralization. It needs to be desacralized because modern man can't understand archaic rituals anymore. All these sorts of things. This type of stuff is in the air, which is why on the ground, again, part of the reason why on the ground all hell breaks loose. You have people, for example, writing Eucharistic prayers and putting them in the liturgy. You have, this is the beginnings of folk masses, of course. People putting, literally, actually it's not really folk music, it's pop folk music into the liturgy. You have all sorts of things going on. I won't go through all this, but all this liturgical madness is paralleled by all of a sudden theologians, academic theologians, beginning to question basic aspects of the faith. Things like clerical celibacy, which is again a discipline, but it's been, it's an old discipline, ancient one. But also things like the nature of the Eucharist. Theologians like Edward Skillibex, Karl Rahner, who are famous at the council, progressive theologians, begin trying to, adapt the notion of the real presence to modern man who can't believe in that anymore. In fact, so much so that in 1965, Paul VI issues an encyclical called Mysterium Fidei, which tried to reiterate the traditional notion of the Eucharist as a sacrifice. The next year, in 1966, he sends a letter called Sacrificium Laudis to the heads of religious orders across the world, urging them to retain the Latin language in their liturgy of the hours. So you have all this stuff going on, which, again, I can't stress this enough. All this stuff is going to be sort of swirling around in people's minds and sort of running together, both the doctrinal confusion and the liturgical confusion. At the same time, that concilium I mentioned before is going to work. It spends the next several years from 1964 to 1969 experimenting with trying to create a new missal, a new set of liturgical books. And in fact, in 1967, it will give a private celebration of this experimental liturgy in front of the Roman Synod. If you know what the Roman Synod is this advisory body of bishops that was created after Vatican II to advise the Pope. And he presents this, they celebrate this new revised liturgy, which, as I mentioned last time, is actually not a revision of the old liturgy. It is a brand new missal, as you will see. And he does it for this synod, and it basically bombs. A third of the synod fathers give their approval to it. A third say no. The other third abstain. And from what we can tell, the other third abstained basically because they didn't want to anger Paul VI, who really wanted this reform. He is simpatico with the secretary of this concilium, Annibal Bugnini, about wanting to create a whole new rite, for reasons that I'll talk about in a moment. They think that the creation of this new missal is something they need to do, basically. And so this is all going on. And this is all going on in the context of course, dissent on other questions like moral questions. 1968, of course, is the year of Humanae Vitae, and the widespread rejection of it by not just lay people, but clergy, even bishops. The issuance of the Dutch Catechism in 1966. The Dutch Catechism is this catechism put out by Dutch bishops, which is very risque. It puts into question a lot of basic doctrines. And this is all taking place, of course, within the scope of the great cultural revolutions of the year 1968. I won't belabor this. Student protests across the world, the crackdown on Hungarian independence movement by the Soviet Union, the Cultural Revolution in China. Worldwide, things going crazy, right? And so what begins to sort of form the Traditionalists into a body unto themselves is, in fact, the promulgation of this new missal in 1969. This is the one that most people, of course, if you're listening to this, is the one you've worshipped with your whole life, or something like it. And he issues his apostolic constitution, as Paul VI, the Missale Romanum, in which basically he means this to essentially replace the old one. Now, this is a key point of contention among liturgical scholars. At one point in the document, Paul says, quote, "We wish that these our decrees and prescriptions may be firm and effective now and in the future, notwithstanding, to the extent necessary, the apostolic constitutions and ordinance issued by our predecessors, and other prescriptions, even those deserving particular mention and derogation," unquote. I say this because he clearly intends this missal to be the missal of the church. But he doesn't come out and say, literally, I hereby abrogate the old liturgy and forbid it and suppress it. And this is going to be the contention among traditionalists, is that he never did that. He never abrogated it officially. And that only the Pope has a right to abrogate certain liturgies, and they're also going to argue that this one shouldn't be abrogated. That's a separate issue. This will be a bone of contention. And that same year, before it goes into effect, he issues this, and I want to say maybe May of that year, I can't recall. But later in the year, it's supposed to go into effect, this new missal. He gives a couple of general audiences to Paul VI. One on November 19th of that year, 1969, one on November 26th. It was scheduled to go into effect November 30th, first day of Advent, 1969, the new missal. And he makes, I'm going to read this to you just because it gives you the basic sense of the arguments he wants to make, why he's doing this. He says on the 19th that, and I'm summarizing, only the expression of faith is going to change with the Mass. The substance will be the same, the structure will be the same. It's the same Mass. And the reason why he's doing this, he gives several reasons over two different talks. One big reason is he wants to make the Mass easier to understand, clearer. He thinks by doing this, and this is the argument, these are arguments made by these liturgical reformers who are allied with him, is that this will make for better understanding by the laity, and they will be more inclined to actively participate in the liturgy. He also says that this is not a, quote, arbitrary act, I'm quoting there, and that the new liturgy has been created by, quote unquote, authoritative experts and therefore is to be trusted. Not only because it's by authoritative experts, but also because he stresses it's demanded by the council. Paul VI and the reformers insist that this is exactly what the council wanted. He'll say things like this again on the 26th, that was on the 19th, that it's necessary for obedience to the council that we do this, because the council called for not just making things easier for people to understand, it called for adaptation. We have to adapt things to the modern situation. Losing Latin will be a great loss, but the vernacular is better because it is more, quote-unquote, apostolic and makes for better understanding by, quote-unquote, modern people. This is actually worth quoting this passage. He says, and he, by the way, admits, Paul VI actually has a genuine love of Latin, although there's more involved in all this. He says, quote, understanding the prayer is worth more than the silken garments in which it is royally dressed. Participation by the people is worth more, particularly participation by modern people, so fond of plain language which is easily understood and converted into everyday speech. Unquote. And this is the kind of argument you hear from the reformers and from Paul VI. Modern people require modern rites. They can't understand archaic rituals. We have to replace it with something new. For the purposes, and again, for the purposes of, this is a pastoral justification, is my point. This is not primarily, as far as I can tell, a theological justification. He never comes out and says, well, the old Mass was evil, we just didn't know it, so we're going to have to replace this. Nope, it's pastoral, right? He's making a pastoral judgment about this. And Annibale Bugnini, who's the secretary of the Concilium, makes the same points, both in his, at the time and in his memoirs, that one of the big rationales for this liturgy is it needs to be adaptive. The old liturgy is too rigid. It's too immobile. That's a term people use, is immobilism. It has to be, they have in their minds ideas, very historicist ideas, if you know what this is, of evolution. The liturgy evolves over the time, and it hasn't been evolving fast enough. We need to make it evolve faster to catch up with modern people. Bugnini actually makes an interesting comparison as well on this, because he mentions the having a more adaptable liturgy for things like missions, right? Among peoples in Africa and places like that. You need to have a liturgy that's adaptable, flexible. One that can be, done in a variety of different ways. And instead of like the old one, which was, again, essentially its genius, if you like, was to be the same everywhere. Now you're going to be adaptive, are the major ideas about this. Thus is this reform introduced. And I need to stress, by the way, this shocked a lot of people. A lot of people weren't aware that the Vatican was planning on rolling out a new missal. And in fact, this is going to be one of the things that effectively sets off this traditionalist movement. Because what happens is, in 1969, they publish this missal. They publish a general instruction to go with it. The general instruction on the Roman Missal. And this is actually going to provoke the first intervention by Una Voce indirectly, because a couple of women, a woman writer whose name escapes me in Italy, Italian members of Una Voce, contact a couple of theologians at the Angelicum and other places in Rome to write a critique of the new Mass. And they go and they write this critique. It's called a short critical study of the new liturgy of the Novus Order or whatever. You can find it on the internet. And they find two cardinals willing to sign off on it. Cardinal Antonio Bacci and Cardinal Ottaviani. Ottaviani had been the former prefect of the Holy Office, what is today the CDF. He was also blind as a bat and didn't know what he was signing, but he signed it anyway. And this was published, and it severely critiques the new missal. And it has a lot of critiques here, but I'll go through. I'll list them and show you why they're upset. They'll particularly be upset about the general instruction, which I'll come to in a moment. But they have other grievances. They think that the prayers of the new missal downplay the real presence and the sacrifice of the Mass. They think that it makes the priest seem less like a mediator than a mere presider. Again, like a Protestant minister, basically. They also make the point that all these changes to the prayers, to gestures, they complain, by the way, about the elimination of gestures, things like eliminating the number of times the priest kneels before the altar, right? Because they think that indicates, that'll send the signal that people don't believe in the real presence. They also object, of course, to, this is a big point of contention with all the people who critique the new missal, is that it basically displaces the old Roman canon. If you don't know what the Roman canon is, that's the only Eucharistic prayer that the old Roman liturgy has ever had, basically. And if you want, what the Eucharistic prayer is, the prayer that the priest prays over the Eucharistic elements, the bread and the wine, to invoke the Holy Spirit, or to invoke God to accept them and have them become the body and blood of Christ. And what the new missal does is it introduces optional prayers, which again this is something that horrifies these. And by the way, the Roman canon is the oldest part of the old missal. It is old, right? It goes back to the 4th century. So all these things, in their minds, this is basically a sort of break with the Church's tradition. But it also is more important because they complain a lot about how it breaks with the intentions of the Council of Trent when they had last revised the Roman Missal. Because one of the things that they were complaining about was, one of the reasons why we call sometimes the Tridentine Missal the Tridentine Missal is because the Council of Trent ordered the Pope to make revisions to the Mass, to make sure that it expressed clearly the doctrines of the faith, like the real presence and the sacrifice of Christ. And the reason why was, back in the 16th century, people were going around and making changes to the liturgy in local places. And not only that, of course, the Protestants had made changes to the Mass, and they wanted to prevent confusion. And so that's why St. Pius V issued that missal, to make those things clear. Not to change anything, not to make a whole new missal, but to do that. That's why he abrogated certain local liturgies that were less than 200 years old, because they needlessly multiplied the faith and made things more confusing. And so it seemed like to these theologians who are making this critique that they were making all these changes which were going to feed into this confusion, which was obviously going on at the time. And this sometimes becomes a point of contention, because they criticize the general instruction, which is of itself a sort of even more problematic, really, than the missal itself. And the reason that sets them off is, what they still refer to, a lot of traditionalists, is the 7th article, the 7th paragraph of that original general instruction of the Roman Missal for 1969. And I'll read it to you. This is what this actually says in the Roman instruction. It says, quote, "The Lord's Supper or Mass is the sacred meeting or congregation of the people of God assembled, the priest presiding, to celebrate the memorial of the Lord. For this reason, Christ's promise applies eminently to such a local gathering of Holy Church, where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there I am in their midst." It's quoting Matthew, unquote. That, of course, if you think about that for a second, sounds a lot like a Protestant version of the Eucharist, which is one of the things that made the people who wrote this critique go ballistic. It sounds like you're turning this into a communal meal. A lot of people are saying this stuff. Theologians are saying this stuff. This looks like Rome has gone over to the dark side, basically. And in fact, there'll be a big to-do about this. I'll get to this in a moment, but this intervention actually forces the Rome to withdraw that original missal. And in fact, for a long time, it was hard to find that original general instruction of the Roman Missal, even in Latin, because it was so controversial. Because not only did I just read you that passage where it describes the Mass as basically a Protestant memorial service, It also hardly mentions sacrifice at all, and it never mentions the Council of Trent at all, which sent off alarm bells, again, in the minds of some of these traditionalists. And like, this is what's going to form them. And a lot of those critiques I just mentioned in that intervention, which is sometimes called the Ottaviani intervention, even though he really didn't have much to do with it, they're going to be central critiques of the new liturgy to this day among people who are traditionalists, both ones who are in communion with Rome and outside of it. They think there are problems, deficiencies in the new missal. And so Rome withdraws that general instruction in the missal, and they rewrite it. And they actually they change that paragraph specifically to make it say the Mass is a sacrifice. They reintroduce mentions of Trent in the general instruction, and they promulgate it again in 1970. And in fact, when they do this, a lot of people who had been critical of the initial text pronounced themselves satisfied, including Cardinal Ottaviani and many others. And in fact, this is the thing that's going to separate the traditionalist out, is that many agree with Cardinal Siri, who's been a leader of the more conservative bishops at Vatican II, who wrote that the council did not ask for any such revolution, unquote. They recognized that what this new missal represented was a break with tradition. Whatever way you want to sort of justify it. And by the way, most traditionalists, I think, recognize the Pope has a right to create new rites. But this is something different, because it looks like an attempt, as we'll see it will be, to suppress the old Mass totally. And so Cardinal Siri says this, and yet he also said, now because it was part of church law, all you could do was obey. And this is where you're going to have the new Mass becoming the sort of dividing line, the new missal becoming the dividing line for people like Una Voce, because this is going to set them on a path. Like, we still have a problem with this. And to wind up with this part of this episode here. In 1970, Una Voce has its first international meeting in New York City, and what happens is Eric de Savenin gives a talk to them, and I want to read some excerpts from it because it kind of captures what the most articulate, the least crazy parts of the traditionalist movement are saying, and that they want to put out there. So let me read part of this. And he hits on the head here, because of course, well, let me read this to you. He addresses this in this speech. The promulgation of the new Ordo Missae brought us face to face with what is fast becoming the loyal Catholic's problem number one: how to combine some familial submission to the Holy Father with respectful but open criticism of some of his acts. He hits the nail on the head, because, of course, this is in the Pope's remit to create new liturgies, right? As you're going to see in a moment, though, some of the things Paul VI does are, in fact, without precedent. He goes on to say, Una Voce should strive to obtain the maintenance of the Tridentine Mass, quote, as one of the recognized rites in the liturgical life of the Universal Church, unquote. He's actually referring to the Vatican II document on that liturgy there. He's quoting that. He goes on to say, but this was not tantamount to a condemnation of the new Ordo. He's talking about what they believe in. By being for the Tridentine rite of the Mass, we are not against the new ordinary of the Mass in a sense of outright rejection, just as we were not against the vernacular when we pleaded for the retention of liturgical Latin. The Church has always known a plurality of recognized rites and of liturgical language. But that pluralism, to use the modern word, grew out of respect for tradition. Thus, St. Pius V himself, when he introduced the Uniformum and Missal at the Council of Trent, specifically confirmed the legitimacy of certain other rites of venerable origin and usage. And so you have this, and he's talking about what's going on. I'm stopping quoting there. He's talking about the situation they're in, about what's going on, all the craziness. He says, quote, we are witnessing just witnessing a repetition, both of the proliferation of unauthorized texts and of episcopal inability to cope with it. He's referring to the Reformation. He goes on, perhaps we may also see a repetition of that act of wisdom, which just over 400 years ago made the bishops ask to draw up and enact in perpetuity the uniform ritual of the Mass, which was promulgated in 1570. He's hoping for that they'll let the old Mass live. He goes on, the pluralism of today is of a different ilk. It is the watchword and war cry of those who want to set tradition aside. That is why, in the midst of a new proliferation of liturgical rites and texts, we witness the practical suppression of the one rite, which in perfect manner enshrines the Church's most sublime treasure, the holy mystery of the Mass. So far, the suppression is achieved de facto only and not de jure. That means in fact and not in law. Indeed, it would be unthinkable for the old Ordo Missae ever to be officially forbidden. To justify this, one would have to argue that it was in some manner wrong or bad, either doctrinally or pastorally. To prove either would be tantamount to denying that the Church is guided by the Holy Ghost. It is therefore inadmissible even to suggest that the old Ordo might be rightfully outlawed. And he goes on to mention all this. He goes on to mention, the situation they're in. But this is the basic argument. That you really can't deny, there's no good reason, theologically speaking, to get rid of the old rite. And it can't be suppressed for purely pastoral reasons, I think, is the response of De Savanthum to what I just mentioned earlier with the arguments of Paul VI. It's not evil. Why should it be suppressed? Doctrinally or pastorally, what was wrong with it that it needed to be, suppressed totally? And he goes on to go into, I won't read the whole thing to you, you can find it on the internet yourself, but one of the things he says is, and this is why I called this episode Disobedient People, is they're in the position of being, basically made disobedient if they don't, and they do accept the new Mass. They're trying to accept that, but they still want to retain the old Mass. He rattles off a bunch of different documents that have been issued by Paul VI since the council, which have been meant to sort of curb abuses, which have been ignored. He goes on to mention all the different doctrines that people have rejected, which have been ignored. He's thinking about things like Humanae Vitae. He's thinking about things like all the things that have been issued since the council. In other words, they're being accused of disobedience just for being faithful to tradition. And I think this isn't right. And he goes on to say, basically, that all these other documents have been disregarded, and I'm quoting him here now, totally disregarded by lay people, by priests, by bishops and cardinals. And indeed, at the very top itself, for more than one reigning pontiff, has gone against the clear injunctions of his immediate predecessors. And I'll leave you with one last quotation here. He says, "It is totally wrong to label us as reactionaries, as people who cling stubbornly to the ways of yesterday, whose minds are closed to necessary and beneficial reform." Because they are basically trying to hold on to that heritage and have it be reformed in an organic way, in a way that's consonant with tradition. What they don't see in the new reforms is something that is consonant with it. And so that's going to be where we leave off in 1970 with the creation of Una Voce and the promulgation of that missal.